Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everybody. Thank you. So I'd like to start this just by giving a brief background. We've been talking, the board has been talking about the DPW site development for over a year now. And our new planner, Jaime Martinez, who has significant planning and economic development experience and had the fortunate experience of starting with us on March 16th rather, so he hasn't seen much of us in person, but has seen a lot of us on Zoom, will be leading the discussion of what the next steps are. Before we get to that, though, I would like to say that this has been a long and considered process. It was a process that recognized that there are many needs in Ossining, and in a diverse community, we sometimes have diverse needs that sometimes can even seem to conflict. However, the basis of this project and what was included in the RFQ did include consideration of the need for affordable housing, the need for commercial development, the need for economic development, and the need to revitalize certain parts of our waterfront in the interest of providing benefits to the community overall. So it's something we take very seriously, and Jaime will be able to take you through a process that provides for significant community engagement in shaping what is now a concept to a project. So I just want to start with that and hand it over to Jaime now so he can talk specifically about what it would mean to go forward with this development project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. So first, I guess I will introduce myself to the general public who may be listening right now. My name is Jaime Martinez. I'm as Karen mentioned, I'm the new planning director for the Village of Ossining. I started on March 16th, which, as most of you recall, is just a couple of days before the beginning of the pause here in New York. And so it's granted me a lot of opportunity to do research online, and unfortunately hasn't given me as much of an opportunity to get that out there in the field. Fortunately, though, I was able to, prior to the pause, visit this site, do a site visit with several members of the team here in the Village of Ossining. And even in my trips up here prior to that, this DPW site is one of the most remarkable sites, I guess you could say, for the village when you get off the train station. It's something that you can't avoid seeing. And so it's understandable that the village has found itself at a place where they're moving forward with making a change here on the site. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. I have prepared a presentation that talks a little bit about this site in specific, in general, the details about what's going on there historically, what's going on there now, and how we got to the point where we are in looking to identify the selection of the developer. So first, we're going to go into the site history. And again, if anybody has any issues seeing this on your site, just let me know. But first, going into the site history, it's a 3.3 acre site bounded by Water Street, Main Street, Seeker Road, and Central Avenue. The site is traversed by the Sing Sing Kill. It contains significant steep slopes on the eastern portion of the lot, and it has a contaminated brownfield site throughout it. The brownfield site, a little more detail on that. This site was basically used as a coal gas plant from the previous use has impacted the groundwater and soil on the site and areas that are down gradient with coal tar. So that means basically any sort of area where the water drains off to, and adjacent sites are also affected by that previous use as a coal gas plant. Because of that, this site is subject to a New York State DEC volunteer cleanup agreement with Con Edison. And you can see this site, as you can see, this site, basically hasn't been used in any sort of significant capacity since the 1850s. It has had various uses over time, but it is a site that is incredibly difficult to develop because of that history of the coal gas plant. And you can see here where my pointer is. This area is where the site is. These two were these are part of where the buildings were, where the coal gas plant was. These buildings are no longer there. And then, later on down the road, there was more development that took place here on the other side of the Sing Sing Kill. So the current use, it's currently used as a DPW yard. As I mentioned, it provides somewhat of an unsightly first impression when you get off the train, unfortunately, because of the way that it's put together. And because of its use as a DPW yard, it prevents the extension of the Sing Sing Kill walkway, which you can gain access to at the community center, but you can't take all the way down to the waterfront because of this use that's right there. So you have to get off and then take the street, as opposed to walking down the entire Sing Sing Kill. Now, getting into the RFQ process, which is essentially what kicked off where we are today. The beginning of this RFQ process started in February 2019. There was a public discussion at a Board of Trustees meeting back then, and as a result of that presentation and discussion, the village decided to engage Housing Action Council, which is a community organization in Westchester County that focuses on affordable housing, to prepare a request for qualifications for developers to develop on the site. That RFQ that was prepared by Housing Action Council was released in July of 2019. At that point, the RFQ was advertised on the village website, and outreach was done to specific developers, multiple developers, to try to get the best possible project and get good responses. That outreach was done by the Housing Action Council. At this point, I want to hand it over to Karen, who can talk a little bit about the sort of rigorousness. This process was very involved in setting up the parameters of what the village was looking at and kind of making a determination about why the village wanted this kind of a use on the site.
So based on the information that we had about the site, knowing about the density issues, knowing about the brownfield issues, some of the challenges of the site, what was required based on other studies in terms of density to address that, and also interest from the development developers who were interested in the site. We had several different developers had reached out to me while I was at IFCA, as well as board members. We looked at the site. As Jaime mentioned, we had Homes and Community Renewal talk to the board, and we talked about ways that the affordable housing, mixed use, mixed income tax credit programs could potentially help on a range of things. So we were very concerned when we did the RFQ to make sure that there was awareness of the fact that we have an overburdened school district and that we don't want to put any undue burden on our school district. There was an awareness that we had a high tax rate, that we were looking for things that would help to, in concert with other initiatives, ease that, help broaden our tax base, but also drive commercial and residential, commercial and retail businesses as well. So we had a heavy lift in terms of what we were asking for developers. We also wanted community benefits. We wanted the extension of the Sing Sing walkway. We wanted more connectivity to Main Street, again, because we saw that as a way to drive some economic development on Main Street. And there were a number of things that the board asked for in the RFQ, and it was a pretty heavy lift. So when we had issued the RFQ and we had 9 highly qualified developers show up for a site visit and 8 respond, we were very pleased. And we met with them at the site. We took them with 8 developers to the site. And during that time, the board and staff echoed the same comments that were mentioned in the RFQ and the criteria and what we were looking for. And of those 8 submissions, through a fairly rigorous process, we were able to narrow down to 3 developers. The board was involved in that process, interviewed 3 developers, and we ended up, the board ended up choosing Wilder Walter Partners to go forward with. But it was based on the response to the RFQ that, again, was very thoughtful and deliberate in making sure that whatever the village did, it balanced the needs as best as possible of all people in the community. So from affordable housing to other issues that we know we need here. Not an easy lift, but we were very pleased with the response. So with that, I hand it back to Jaime.
Thank you, Karen. So just moving right along, this is not to repeat a little bit of what Karen said, but the RFP was released July of 2019, and responses were provided by multiple developers by September of 2019. At that point, developers were interviewed in winter of 2019 by the RFQ Selection Committee, consisting of members of the Housing Action Council, village staff members, and members of the Board of Trustees. At the direction of the RFQ Selection Committee, references were at that point checked for Wild Developer Partners, to really kind of look into some of the different work they've done and make sure that other communities are agreeing with the statements that they're saying about themselves. So outreach was done to many different communities, including Big Skill, New Rochelle, and others. Now, we can talk a little bit about what a LADA is, because that's essentially the heart of where this discussion is going and the selection of the developer would be leading to. So to give some background information just for the general public and for any board members who may be less familiar with it, the LADA is a land acquisition and disposition agreement. And it's one process that the village can follow for the sale of real property, which means land in this instance, or buildings. There are other options that the village could move forward with, but they're not advantageous. The most common that you see is auctioning the property without conditions. And so the village could say, look, we have this land and we don't really care what happens here. So we're going to auction it to the highest bidder, and whoever will give us the most money, we'll take that. But there are no conditions that you can impose on a bid, on an auction. So whatever the person goes and buys, within the context of what's permissible on the site, they can do with as they please. So in this instance, a LADA allows the village to control the development that results on the site because they control the site. So until they hand the property over to the developer who's going to build on it, they have a say in what comes through. So if the developer says, well, I can't build that, the village can always go back and say, well, we're not going to sell it to you. And that's why you want to go through the process of using the LADA to get projects like this developed. Again, there are some circumstances where auctions make sense, and there are some circumstances where it makes sense to do it this way. The village decided when they were going through the RFQ process that this was the best direction forward. Again, a LADA really is advantageous to the village, amongst other reasons, because it provides a forum for community input into the project, and it's more likely to lead to a project that is consistent with community goals rather than to hand over a site without any sort of development controls like that are come from the LADA process. So going on to the civic engagement process, I know that one of the biggest concerns about anything that takes place regarding the site is about the civic engagement, the community engagement process, and making sure that there's real opportunity for the community to weigh in on this. So it was really important when we were putting this presentation together to clarify the various steps that are involved in this process. What's actually being discussed right now, which is the selection of the developer, and how many steps there are throughout the timeline that include community engagement and opportunities for the community to weigh in, what can be talked about, what can be worked out over time. So that's what this section is all about. So again, the public process for this redevelopment began in February 2019. So we're now more than a year into this process. It's not been a lot of process that's necessarily taking place in front of the community, but the beginning of this process was in February 2019, and that did take place in front of the community, as well as the RFQ being submitted to the website. So it's something that has had a lot of community engagement and has had certain engagement up to this point to get us here. There's a lot of studies that fit into the determination that the economic needs for the community were to create some affordable housing, to try to get the brownfield redeveloped, to try to find economic stuff. And so those studies included public process as well, which fed into the decision to put out this RFQ. Again, The continuing civic engagement process is robust, and there's, like I said before, it's going to provide the public with multiple opportunities to learn about and weigh in on the process in the future. And the review of this project will include 3 separate boards. That includes the Board of Trustees, the Planning Board, and the Environmental Advisory Committee. So starting back with 2019, there was the beginning of this civic engagement process was in the public discussion of the preparation of an RFQ. This took place in February of 2019. This is just the beginning of the process. And again, the public discussion of the redevelopment of the DPW site centered around turning it into mixed income affordable housing, which started at the Board of Trustees meeting formally as a public process in February 2019. This discussion led the village to hiring Housing Action Council to prepare the RFQ that the current developer, amongst others, responded to. And after an evaluation by the Housing Action, after the evaluation of the RFPs by Housing Action Council, the selection committee, after interviewing multiple people, recommended that WildBalter be the chosen developer for this site. Now, this is the phase that we're at now. It's the selection of a developer to negotiate a LADA with. That's the subject of today's discussion, and the result of this decision will enable the village to negotiate exclusively with WildBalter on the terms of the sale and the redevelopment of the site for a limited period of time of 180 days, which is 6 months, essentially, to negotiate the terms or determine that there is no deal to be had and sort of both parties can move on. Now, there are a few components of this that are open for discussion. There are others that really aren't part of the negotiation process at this point. Mixed income affordable housing was a part of the RFQ. The developer decided to, the developer essentially responded to that RFQ that the village put out. So that's not going to be a component of the negotiation. If the village felt like mixed income affordable housing was not the right thing for the site, then they shouldn't enter into negotiations with any developer that was part of that responding group, because they responded to a different application than what the village would want. But that RFQ stated that you wanted mixed income affordable housing. That's what they responded to. So that's not a component of negotiation. However, the size of the project, as well as any public or commercial amenities, including community space, expansion of the Sing Sing Kill walkway, a public garage, or any other items, are really going to be part of the negotiation. And that's where the details of the LADA come into play. The next step would be the approval of the terms of the land acquisition and disposition agreement. The village will negotiate directly with the developer on the proposal of this project. The details of this project, including public amenities, unit count and size, and commercial uses, will be influenced by the financing agencies, including New York State DHCR and Westchester County. And this is an important piece to note. I think that it's easy to come up with a wish list of all the items that you want, but at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for it. So those financing agencies, I think, are certainly going to be willing to pay for a lot of that stuff. But at the end, those costs have to be borne out by somebody. And if the terms that the village have are not financeable, then that project can't happen and therefore won't happen. Now, the result of this will create the text of what's going to go into the LADA. The details of the LADA must be available for public review prior to the approval of the Board of Trustees, and the LADA will form the basis of the special permit application that will start into the next step with the Board of Trustees. So the next step is the special permit to the Village Board of Trustees, and the project as detailed in the LADA will be submitted for review and approval. At that point, the Board of Trustees will undertake the public environmental review of the project pursuant to New York State SEQR laws. So that's the preparation of an environmental assessment form and opening discussion of the items that need to be looked at for environmental review, whether that's school children analysis, traffic studies, or any other items that exist on the site that need to be reviewed. Along with that, the project will be referred to the Environmental Advisory Committee for review of coastal assessment form per the requirements of the local waterfront revitalization plan. Again, that's not an option. As soon as this project comes in for review, it has to go to the environmental advisory committee. The project would also be referred out to the planning board for site plan approval. All right. So the next step is talking about the planning board, which has site plan approval. The planning board will review the project for consistency to make sure that it meets all site regulations that are required under the village code. Planning may also choose to provide comments to the Board of Trustees in regards to the SEQR review, where the Board of Trustees will be lead agency. And there will be, during this process, there's going to be multiple public hearings that will be held over the course of the review of the application in response to comments from the public and the board to ensure that the board is satisfied that the public has weighed in and that those comments have been sufficiently addressed by the developer. Next step in the process are the public hearings on the LADA, SEQR, and the special permit. The Board of Trustees is required, in order to approve the LADA, to finalize the determination on SEQR and to grant the special permit, are required to hold a public hearing. Now, the Board of Trustees can choose to combine the public hearings into a single public hearing, but the Board of Trustees may also choose to extend the public hearing over more than one session. So they could extend the public hearings on all these matters up until they're satisfied to make a decision. So I would anticipate that this process will require multiple public hearings for the SEQR alone to get through this process. Another important piece of this is that the Board of Trustees will be required under SEQR to consider any correspondence that comes in through the mail, as well as any emails they're submitting as correspondence to this project. And the important part of that is that it means that residents do not need to attend this in person to provide their input. And I know that that's a big concern. It's always great to have things be equal. If in the event that the village is not able to, in 8 or 9 months or a year, when you would have these public hearings on the site, in the event that they're not able to do that in public, in person, they would still be able to engage in this process. And I would assume that, within 8 months, we're going to have a better sense of how to maneuver the post-COVID world. But if things continue to move forward as they have, before any of those decisions are even made, it's most likely that we will have, return to some form of public forum at that point. But who knows? Another thing that the Board of Trustees can do is, because the fact that you own the site, the Board of Trustees can require the developer to augment the normal public engagement process to include a more robust community engagement, such as presentations at a community center, virtual site tours, or any other form of public engagement process that they think is important to make sure that this process gets the proper level of attention that it needs. This is something that I've done, on a personal level with sites in previous work that I've done. 2 different occasions where developments had come forward. Developers prepared a presentation off-site from where the proposed project was, brought in community members, showed them how the project would work, got a chance to meet the developers to get a better sense of what they were interested in doing, and ask questions in person. There's a public component to all this, right, where you have to do public hearings, but there's also, I think, an interest for people to be able to kind of peruse it at their leisure and not just have to listen to somebody who's sort of dictating it at a presentation. And that's the usefulness and the utility of having one of these separate presentations where somebody could go up to the community center and just kind of nosh on some snacks and read descriptions and ask the architect who will be there, or ask the developer who's there, or ask any other engaged individuals about the project to get a little more information about what the plan is. It's something it's a part of the community engagement process, and I find that it's very helpful in my experience to do that, especially where people are concerned and have questions about the project. The next step would be the conditional approval of the sale of the property. One of the I heard from one of the trustees today actually was, what happens if we we agree to this and then they don't do anything? And so, upon completion of the public review of the SEQR process, the village would vote to approve the special permit in the LADA. But the village can choose to make the sale conditional on construction financing to ensure that the site is developed as proposed and not flips. Essentially, the village can choose to condition it on the closing of the sale. So, there's a lot of financing that has to line up in any project. This would be, a state-funded project, a county-funded project. And so for an affordable housing project, these closings all kind of takes place simultaneously. People go down to Manhattan. There's attorneys for all the different parties there. There's, 50, 60, 70 different copies of contracts pertaining to different financing mechanisms that are part of it. And they're all there signing these forms at the closing. So that LADA could be finalized at that closing where at the same time that the financing is received from the tax credit investors or the financing from the Westchester County or whoever it is they're getting money from, the village is taking the money for the property and the LADA is essentially tied to the closing of that construction financing. Once that construction financing goes in, the development has to move forward, right? The county, the New York State is not going to give funding to a project and open up their books to pay for a project unless they are confident that that developer can get it accomplished and completed. And the LADA can be tied directly to that process. Now, this last slide, I know I've been drawing on here for a little while, so get into the last few seconds here. The approval, again, will require multiple steps. The step that we're talking about today, the very next step in this process would be the selection of a developer for 180 days in order to do proper community engagement and flesh out what the terms of that LADA will be for the project development. After that point, it goes into the process that would get the special permit from the Board of Trustees. You'd have SEQR review and a negative declaration of adverse environmental impact if that's a result of that process. You would have the review by the EAC. You'd have site plan approval by the planning board, and finally, you would have the LADA approval by the Board of Trustees. So that's the process. That's the site and the process. And if you have any questions, I will try to do the best I can to answer.
Yeah, Jamie, Jaime, I have one question. That last slide, we go back to that last slide?
Yep.
Where, we put this time frame of 180 days. Everything that's underneath that 180 days, they're expecting to get done in those 180 days?
No. 180 days is basically you give yourself 180 days to develop the terms of a land acquisition and disposition agreement, which will be the project that at the end of that period of time, which could take 180 days, it could take less, but the result of that period will be an application for a special permit to the Board of Trustees. So none of the other stuff can happen until the terms of that LADA are completed. So you have the next option basically gives you 180 days to negotiate exclusively with Wildwood Berkshire on the terms of that LADA, much of which you already understand, but some of which is still open to negotiation. And again, that 180 days ties you to nothing except for that you're going to continue with the discussion with this individual and nobody else.
So basically, that 180 days, we're going to be working on the LADA.
Yeah. And if at 180 days, if you determine that you don't like this plan and you don't like this developer, the 180 days are over. If you've done nothing, then everybody walks away. Now, I don't think that you should enter into an agreement to walk away from it.
Right.
But you don't have any obligation by selecting this developer to do anything with them if it turns out that despite best efforts, you were unable to come up with terms that were agreeable to all parties.
All right,
can I just interrupt for a second? Since I just wanted the public to understand, this is a work session. This is not, there are members of the public on here, and I know we're doing it on Zoom, so I want to get this right. If you have questions, you can ask, but this is actually a presentation. to the board generally. It's not a question and answer for the public, although because Zoom allows us to have you just put in some questions, we have a host. I guess the host is Maddie. Are you the host?
I think Maddie has made me the host briefly.
Okay. So you
Or
can
not-
take questions.
I'm actually the host. Sorry.
Okay. So
Yeah.
if you could take, so the mayor has recused herself. So if we could just follow, I'll go last as deputy mayor. I'll just run this part of it. We should just have trustees ask questions. If there are questions on the Q&A, maybe we can accumulate them and sort of figure out what we want to do, because it's a work session, not a legislative session. And if you could take the presentation off, that way we can all see each other. And you could just share it with us again when we need to ask for specific slides. Is that right, Jaime?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so why don't we do that? So, Bob, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted for people who are tuned into this to sort of just understand the process. So,
I understand.
back on, Bob.
That last slide seemed a little confusing. That's why I just wanted that spelled out. That's all. I'm good.
Any other trustees? I'm sure there are.
Sure, I guess I'll take over that one since that Omar didn't go first. I'll take.
That's a first.
No, thank you, Jaime, for this. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff to catch up, obviously, and sort of like the briefing that you gave us as an overall picture is very helpful. So let me ask you a couple quick questions for now, and I'll probably ask you a couple more if my colleagues, they don't ask you what I think they may be asking you. So let's say if the board decided not to go with an RFQ process, and we decided last year that we were going to go on RFP. What is the main difference between an RFQ and an RFP at this level?
So if you have an RFQ, usually what that means is that you've decided that you have a pretty good idea of what you want to do on the site. You may not know everything within the four corners of what's going to happen on that site, but you know generally what you'd like to see presented to you. At that point, you want to determine amongst a list of qualified applicants who is the best capable to provide you what you have requested in your RFQ. If you ask for an RFP for the site, then what you would be doing is going out to developers and saying, look, we have this 3.3 acre site. What do you think you can do with it? You would go to all of those developers and you could get anything. So to give you some background, there are lots of municipalities that have sites that they can't get developed, and they haven't figured out any focus group tasks. So they put out RFPs for sites, and they know what they want, but they don't ask for it. And so the proposals that they get are not consistent, and oftentimes that yields proposals that are somewhat useless. The RFQ process at least allows you to make an initial decision to say, we think we know what we want on this site. So since we know what we want, we're going to put it out there and explain our vision to the developers. And we want to hear back from them to see whether or not they're capable of doing it. The benefit of doing it that way in this instance, and it's not always the best way to do it, but in this instance, the benefit of doing the RFQ is that you had developers who really kind of, took the pen to paper and figured out whether they could financially create something that was consistent with the vision that the village had put forward. And that yields, I think, in this instance, a better project. Because if people are sort of competing against each other, people can say, look, I want to do this, I want to do that. But their financing may not be so clear. Their capabilities may not be so clear. So they can propose whatever. Somebody could come in and say, I want to do a medical, emergency medical, site. I want to do a nursing school. I want to do all these things. And you say, oh, that sounds like a great proposal. But the process for them may not be so clear. In this instance, because there's so much state subsidy connected to this, the financing mechanism for this makes it a little easier for people to move forward. So then you get a chance to sort of evaluate, this person against other people who have similar experience building different levels of affordable housing to figure out whether or not, hey, I like the work that they did in other places. And I think that they can do it. They come highly recommended from, other municipalities who have done similar work. And so I appreciate what they're doing. You're comparing apples to apples. if you put out the RFP, you're comparing apples to oranges, essentially.
Thank you. So the next question is, I guess, because you did mention the financial portion of this project. What does it mean if it was a normal year, if this was done last year, let's say? Obviously, it will be a little bit of a different conversation right now. But because of where we are right now, what does that mean for the 180 days? Let's say we had previous conversations with the developer in regards to the money, but no one really has said we have well, maybe the county has in a way, but no one really has said we have the money. We're going to give you all this money to proceed with this project. Within 180 days that we have this preferred developer status, when do we know exactly the finances of this particular project may be headed? So that to me is one of the biggest concerns of what this whole situation, this pandemic is that the world is going through right now. I saw a couple articles this today in regards to the New York State is asking for $60 billion, I believe, for federal funding, for federal aid. So I don't know, I really don't know what the finances of even the state is right now and going forward with the project. I like the project. I'm supportive of the project, but I have a lot of concerns in regards to that, obviously. So when do we know?
I think that's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it in sort of a two-part response. There is the sort of the, if you go back a year and you look at the traditional financing of any project, every project essentially gets built off of credit. There is almost nobody that will come in and throw down $100 million or $50 million out of their own pocket to finance a project anywhere. That's just not how construction happens 99.9% of the time. Most people go to banks and they say, I have a project that I want to put forward. And they have to go to those banks, which are almost always very rigorous in saying, well, what are your projected incomes on the site? Are you going to make money from rent? Are you making money from sales, from this, that, the other thing? What are your projected expenses? How much are you going to pay in taxes? How much is it going to cost for the construction of the site? Are there any additional challenges that haven't been thought of? And then those banks who specialize in construction financing will go forward and say, okay, we think that your numbers are good. We've had our underwriters take a hard look at this to make sure that it can happen. We're willing to give you financing. You have an obligation to provide this much of your own capital in the process so that you have sort of skin in the game to make sure that you don't walk away from this project and that we as a bank don't finance a project that's going to fail. In this instance, because it's a little different, it is a sort of publicly subsidized project. It has different income streams, but affordable housing is not like traditional, market rate or commercial financed projects. The funding that is used to pay for affordable housing comes from generally a few different streams. There is in New York State and really throughout the country, there's tax credit money. And so the way that tax credits work is that banks are obligated to support affordable housing under the Community Reinvestment Act. That money is done through tax credits. And that tax credit provides the money that is required to pay for affordable housing. Now one thing that is important to note that if affordable housing, in most instances, if it was built with private financing, it would lose money. It is not something that could be built without subsidy, and that's why there is such a massive tax credit program. That's why all affordable housing has to be pretty much without almost all the time has to be funded through public financing and some sort of public subsidy. So the tax credit program really doesn't change that much. There are slowdowns right now in terms of the funding because of the pandemic. I haven't had the opportunity to talk to any DHCR people, but in my experience in the past, the biggest challenge with financing this, even the best of times, is that you have to come in at specific scheduling rounds. So they have, closings that take place at certain periods of time. And so when those closings don't happen, they get pushed back to the next round of closings. So because you've had so many places closed, and a lot of the deals that are happening here get closed in New York City. So as long as you can't actually physically get the lawyers in the same place, there's no ability to file stuff with the clerk. All these things prevent any of these closings from taking place. And so that means that right now, from the start of the pause until today, there's a backlog that continues to get built up. Once the pause is lifted, that backlog will start to clear out, and projects that are in the pipeline will be able to move forward, and projects that are farther out in the pipeline that are just sort of in the indie phases will come onto line. So there's going to be a gap in the amount of time that it may take, but it's more of a mechanical problem, I think, than an actual funding problem. It's not that banks don't have to continue providing subsidies to tax credit programs. I don't think that's the case at all. I think the reality is that there's just that mechanical issue. Now, from the county side, you have money that comes in from HUD. That's federal dollars. So one of the easiest way for the federal government to inject money into industry, into jobs, is to provide funding through programs like home financing, which pays for affordable housing, and that goes directly into construction. So, in the past, in the stimulus that you had under Obama, lots of money went into different infrastructure projects, but also went into affordable housing. And even under this recent coronavirus bill, there's a lot of additional money that was put into the CDBG program to help specifically with coronavirus-related items. I think that looking forward, we haven't seen any diminishment in the amount of money that's come into the home program for years. I don't anticipate that that's going to change anytime soon. And honestly, it's possible that you may even see an increase in the amount of funding to the home program, because there's always a need for affordable housing. And it's an easier way to get money into the hand of contractors and developers, who are really some of the drivers of new job creation in the country. And that's something that's sort of recognized across political spectrum. So I don't anticipate, even if there is an issue, that it's going to be something that we're going to be waiting years for. I think that by the time that the process is wrapping up, if we do, the village does decide to move forward with this, by the time the process is wrapping up to end the LADA, they'll be well positioned to take advantage of financing that should be available at that point.
Thank you. So my last question again on this one will be in regards to obviously the timing as well. So we have the 160 days. That gives us about 6 months, as you mentioned. That all puts us
180 days,
to almost the end of the year. As we know, we have some members in the community, even like the concern is the engagement on the public part. Sure, so what does that picture look like going forward? I mean, it's difficult right now with what is going on right now. So I guess that question would be towards the developer of this particular project, in a way where what is the plan that he may have if we decide to move forward with this particular case. But what does it look like? And if the board's not satisfied with the engagement and the participation of the public at that point, do we end the relationship before the 180 days, or do we have to wait until this whole thing is the 180 days done? Because I would hate for us to put the developer in a position where he definitely is going to be investing money on a project that at the end of the day we may say, what, this is not good for us, or the community doesn't feel that this may work for them, or do we wait? Because right now the state is supposed to be open up on the 16th, but we don't know that. There's stages that we have to go through. Do we, what does it look like? I guess, I know no one has a crystal ball, but, what does that mean for us in these times that we have a lot of unknowns, I guess, for everything, including our own budget. We don't know a lot of the stuff, what's going on.
I think that, I'm going to try to answer this as best as I can, but I think that, there's an obligation as a village to try to take the next right step, right? Small steps, incrementally towards progress, towards getting to a goal that you're trying to get. For this process, the next small step that you're able to take is the selection of a developer. After 180 days, if it doesn't work out, or if it's clear throughout the process that the terms can't be met that are agreeable to both sides, then it'll make sense to part ways. But at the same time, it's not a good idea to enter into a process that you are already, you've already determined should not be entered into. I think that, my evaluation of this site on a professional level is that it's a good project in that sense. It is, it meets a lot of the criteria of what has been talked about up to this point. So it's consistent with the goals that I think the village has pushed forward with. And I think that it would be a good use for the site. I think that the fact that it's laid fallow since 1940s and has not been redeveloped, speaks volumes to the challenges that come with developing the site over the years. And so that's an important piece of the puzzle to be considered. So I wouldn't, say that it's a good idea to move forward with a developer if you're certain that this is the wrong use for that site and this is the wrong thing. It's not a good look for the village. It's not a responsible move, I think, for us to take. But that being said, if you do believe that this developer is the right person to begin negotiation with, then you just need to understand that that is all that you are making a decision on. You're making a decision on the next step. You're not making a decision on the project, the merits of this project, because although you have the outlines of what the project may look like at the end of the 6 months, you don't know what that project actually will be, because those discussions include not just the village and the developer, but they involve the financing agencies that would be funding this project as well. So that's the point where you determine, what are the next steps. So maybe once you come to terms on what the LADA is going to look like, that's when you take that into a more robust political, community engagement process. And you say, look, these are the terms of LADA. This is what we think is going to work, but we want to hear from the community and see how you feel about it. You go into that community engagement process. And if after the community engagement process, you realize, this is not the right fit, you haven't signed any contracts, you haven't moved forward with the LADA, and you part ways. Part of the risk of being a developer is taking the risk to invest your money in trying to get projects developed. I can tell you right now, I know this developer's already invested a significant amount of money in just putting together this proposal, as did all of the other developers who were not selected. So that's just, part of the process. But you don't want to get caught up on what could happen 6 months down the road. You still are in the driver's seat in determining the terms of the negotiation for the LADA and determining the kind of community engagement that should take place moving forward. You can ask the developer what their opinion is on how to do the community engagement, or you can really dictate to the developer, this is the kind of community engagement we need to do. And I think while it's still kind of early from an online engagement process for us sort of post-COVID, we are starting to learn some things. We know that people are online a lot more than they used to be. So while Facebook and Instagram were things that people used before, people are really actively on there, spending much more hours. There's quite a few studies that talked about sort of the jumps in the amount of time people spend on these online forums. So we do know that there's a way to engage people without actually engaging them in person. So that may be part of the process. And if the pause changes, we could be looking at a situation where in 4 months, we are having public meetings where, somebody shows up to a public hearing and they're handed a mask and they're invited to come in and they take part in the process. We don't know what that looks like, but we do know that things have changed just in even the 8 weeks since we started with this pause.
Thank you.
No, thank you, and that's very helpful. And again, I was supportive of this project last year, and I think this is something that part of what a lot of the elements that meet that criteria that we all agree on this process and moving forward. So thank you for all that.
Rick, I just have one quick question. So, Jaime, when does the trying to say this? Say we picked a developer. When does the clock start for him to look into financing, and knowing that he's going to get this financing from the state or from the county? When does that clock start? After we pick them?
I think it's an iterative process. I mean, so he's already begun engagement with the financing agencies for this project. There are a few things that are important to note about public financing. One thing that you will never get from, a tax credit entity like HCR is you'll never get a letter saying, I guarantee you're going to get this money. They won't ever do that. They'll give you a letter saying we support your project. They'll talk to you through the process. They'll demand you get a letter from everybody else. They'll never give you that letter. They'll schedule a closing. On the day of the closing, they'll sign and say, okay, now you're getting your money. So you have to go through that engagement process from the beginning. They've already done outreach to HCR. They've already done outreach to the county. We've done outreach to the county to talk to them. Well, I haven't personally, but I know that Karen has spoken with Norma Drummond from the county to talk about the availability of financing for this project. So they'll all say informally. But the thing I think that is more important than getting those guarantees ahead of the process is getting those guarantees through the LADA process. So the LADA can be tied directly to the closing of that construction financing. And so if you say to somebody, look, we're going to sign this LADA, you have, X amount of time to get your financing, or we're not going to move forward with this LADA. That's how you do that. And so, you understand the sort of impossibility of getting guarantees from entities who don't give guarantees. They only sign contracts once they're ready to sign contracts with all their underwriters and everything else. They go through that process and get them to that point. And that's really all you can do. So, we control the land, and that's without the land, you cannot build a building. So that's really important, right? And without money, you cannot build a building. Everybody has their own piece. So as long as we're all working towards that closing date, we're working towards that point which HCR and the county and everyone else is putting their money on the table and saying, okay, we're going to buy it, we're going to invest in this, we're going to do this, and the transfer of this property doesn't take place until that happens, then that's the way you ensure that the project moves forward.
All right, thank you.
Omar, do you want to jump in?
I'll jump in. I'd be happy to. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So thank you, Jaime, for the presentation. Super informative, really detailed, really appreciate it. I've done a bunch of research on this land, and one of the things that I couldn't find is how it became a brownfield property to begin with, and so I appreciate that nugget specifically because it's not one that has been widely available. So and I realize my internet may be a little unstable here, so if it's difficult to hear me, let me know. My comments are this. So I recognize, first of all, I want to say that I am really supportive of this project. It's meeting a lot of the needs that the community has. Not only, we spend a lot of time talking about affordable housing, and it's definitely part of it because it's a mixed income development, but it's also mixed use. I think that has not taken up enough of this conversation. It's an opportunity to have not only retail, but also a community space down near the waterfront. It connects the waterfront to Main Street. Like you've mentioned, Jaime, extends the Sing Sing Hill walkway. There's a lot of great things. And in addition to just being one, the beautification of a part of our community, one of the first things that you see when you enter our community from the waterfront. So recognizing that this process has been going on for a year, there was a long period between February and August, really, where there wasn't a lot of activity with this project. And it then started up again in August and now in 2020 in earnest. And as this has become much more part of the public conversation, there's a spectrum of expression, a belief that people have about a project like this. On one side of the spectrum, you have folks who are against the development of any kind of housing, period. There's no Prezi, no PowerPoint, no Google slides, no document you can show folks that are on this side of the spectrum to convince them that there should be housing here. These folks believe, period, there should be no housing. Then there are folks that believe we should have housing, affordable or not, we just need more housing. They'll point to housing studies and so forth. That perspective exists as well. Then there are a lot of people in the middle who may say, well, I think it would be interesting, but I'm concerned about taxes, or I'm concerned about schools, or I'm concerned about traffic, right? Just look at 9A, it's going to be even busier. Or I'm concerned about the environment, or whatever it is, whatever the concerns are. Those specific concerns are going to be raised over the course of the next 180 days at the very least, and really throughout this process. And the developer is going to respond to those and say, here's how we can accommodate to meet those concerns. In my understanding of the situation, looking at the final package, which will be a compromise across all of these different elements, it should address a lot of the concerns that these folks in the middle have raised and create a project that is going to be a net positive. If a project is a net negative, environmentally, fiscally, educationally, or in any other way, then I certainly wouldn't be supportive of it, and neither would the board, I would imagine. But the reason that we're here in the first place is because we believe it's going to be a net positive. So, given that, I am certainly in favor of moving forward with the process. One of the concerns that has been raised generally is, well, look at the timing of this. We have coronavirus going on and all of this. Shouldn't we wait until we can meet in person? Well, the reason that I would, and that is a criticism that I take to heart, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And I was one of the main people a month ago when this was first on the agenda that said, before we move forward with Wilder-Balter as the preferred developer, can we put the pause on this for a second? We're at the height of coronavirus. Folks are not paying attention to this. Let's give it a little bit of time. And so we've given it a month, and the numbers are going down. And of course, there are people in our community still being affected by this economically and health-wise, but is not where it was a month ago. And I'm almost done. So the reason that I bring that up is because as important as it is to recognize the time period that we're in, it's not as if the world we were living in 4 months ago or a year ago, where we were to have public sessions where people can comment publicly, it would be easy for everyone to go. If you have childcare issues, if you work nights, we have these meetings Wednesday nights. If you can't come because you're working, it's tough, right? You can email your thoughts, but it's not the same as showing up in person. And so all of a sudden, what the environment we're in has created is an environment where some of the folks who would usually go in person wouldn't be able to, but also where some folks that wouldn't be able to go in person can because they are home. And so we find ourselves with a different mix of people who are able to participate. My hope is that as many people as possible do participate, and I think we'll be able to tell over the course of the next 180 days at the very least, if not the entire process, whether that is true or not. My sense is that it is true. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be moving forward with a lot of the other priorities that we have. And finally, this will be the last thing that I'll say, and you can respond, Jaime, or not to any of this. But the last thing that I'll say is that we are now entering a phase of the coronavirus pandemic where we're looking at what reopening looks like. And for a lot of states, that means what immediately does it mean we can have barbershops open, restaurants, concerts? Like, what does reopening mean? One of the elements that I would throw in there is that reopening should not just be a conversation about what do we do immediately. Obviously, it should be that, but also what are we going to be doing to set ourselves up for what the world will look like post-COVID? And a part of that is if we're saying we're going to wait until there is a vaccine and you can have 50 people in a room together with no fear of catching the coronavirus, and that's the barometer that you're measuring anything of substance with that requires public engagement, then we're going to be delaying the amount of progress that we're able to make in our community by a really long time. And the people that are most vulnerable to that are the ones that tend to be the least able to advocate for themselves in environments like this. And so my push would be to start this process in the world that we are living in, because it's moving so quickly. We don't know what it's going to look like 3 months, 6 months, 2 years from now, and do so knowing that we prioritize public engagement. We want it to be a net positive for our community, and that ultimately this is a project that we are in favor of as long as it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. I think it's important to note that the taxes, the tax rate that so many people are concerned about doesn't get any better when nothing moves forward. And so the only way to really move forward is to try to put forward projects that are a net benefit, a net positive for the village. And so this project has been evaluated up to this point. An RFQ was put out that the village believed would yield a project that would create a net positive impact for the village. It's important to actually see what the terms of that deal will be, so then you can evaluate it on those terms. But doing nothing, right? Doing nothing is just a decision that states that the status quo is okay, right? That in itself is a decision. And so what I think has been clear from what I've, ascertained from people is that the tax rate, the high taxes, is not okay. And that is the status quo that the village has to work towards addressing. And so this is part of that process. It has to be evaluated. I think everybody kind of is on the same page that it has to be evaluated in those terms. And the decision on what the village, what you as a board do here is going to be based off of whether it is good and in the best interest of the village or not. And if it's not, then you won't move forward with this and you'll do something else. And if it is, then you will move forward with this project. But doing nothing, right, saying we're going to stop here, doesn't change that fact. In 8 months, if we wait until there's a vaccine, we don't know when that's going to happen. Then that means that's time where that tax burden has not changed at all. Nothing has changed. And so that problem, which is so preeminent on people's minds, has not improved at all, at least not as a considered as a piece of this project or as a piece of development. And so it's important to not lose sight of that. I think you don't want to make bad decisions, but you don't want to stop in your tracks either. It's this analysis paralysis is what we call it in planning. But we don't want to enter into a phase of analysis paralysis in the village where we don't know. We think we don't know what's going on, so we can't make any decisions. And I think that I think your points are really well made and well taken. So.
Thank you. Omar, is there any more that you wanted to add?
No, thank you.
Okay. So, and we can keep talking about it. So, I agree with everything that has been said, and therefore I don't really find it necessary to repeat it. It's taken a little bit of a different turn because the conversation tonight is not, with all due respect, about going forward and doing nothing. That I think is a comment that I would take issue with. The issue and the conversation is that we, and I think it was Manny, and I think it was actually maybe all of us. The history is that last year there was a unanimous board vote to move forward with the project. The timeline that's stated, although we always state these timelines, and it feels like if you say February of 2019, that for an entire year, lots of time was spent on it. There are periods, as Omar had said, where things are done, and there are periods where, you do other things, right? I mean, we meet once a week, and other projects are going on. So the timelines are important, but they have to be in context. The other context is tonight's meeting. It was fantastic. Jaime, I think, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, it's like a 10 because it is rare for us, and we haven't had a planner in a long time, that can, and really in what I consider to be eloquent yet simple terms, explain what an RFQ is, what an RFP is, the process, the history. As Omar had said, there was a nugget there about the contamination that I myself did not know either. He didn't know it, so really great stuff. I learned something new every Wednesday in every one of these meetings. It's actually the most pleasant part of being a trustee for me. It's just been phenomenal and stays with you for many years. So that's why I highly recommend it. People become trustees. I think it's a fascinating lesson. Having said that, I don't think that the issue is whether we're going to find a solution to a pandemic next week or in 6 months or in 12 months. My guess is that we will never find a solution to pandemic viruses like the common cold, which has been around forever. We haven't solved for the common cold because it's not always solvable. I think the issue of exhaustion on the part of a community that is typically highly engaged when it comes to these, not controversial, but highly engaged in anything to do with public space being used for something. This is not about putting a bench park up. And even that, by the way, took us a year to go through 3 committees to figure out how to do that. Just wanted to put that out there, having gone through myself. And I think that no matter how much you engage the public, there's always a group of people, and Omar didn't say this, so I don't want to repeat what he said so eloquently, just to add, so that, I don't need to hear myself talk. I just listened carefully to what everybody said, and I just want to add to those pieces, okay? So the thing I would add is that, and Omar was right, about a month ago, when we decided to move this another month, we didn't know actually that we were at the height of pandemic until probably today. You don't know when you're at the height of something until you see it decline. So we didn't know we were at the height a month ago. All we knew a month ago is that we were in the middle of something pretty horrific and we didn't see the ending to it. Frankly, we're not seeing the ending to it now. What we're seeing is an end to death, a total reduction in death. We're not seeing people who are spouting back up because they have jobs, because they don't. More and more people are actually losing their job. We're not seeing people being able to take care of their children in a proper way. We're not seeing a comeback to anything yet. One could argue the economic part of this is actually not at the peak yet. All to say that I think people are thoroughly exhausted right now. My feeling, and we would need a majority vote, this is a work session, of whether we will vote so that next week this will come up in the legislative session. I believe, Hyman, that's what we're actually talking about today.
Yes.
Correct? Okay.
Yes.
So just, again, for the public, I mean, I think the trustees know that. When I've spoken to trustees, except for the mayor, who, while involved in the vote last year, is recused himself now so that the public understand, because this is being recorded. I know people will be looking at this video. I know they'll be cutting pieces of it and sharing on social media. So I just want to make sure that things are being said for the public record, because your presentation tonight was fantastic. So much so that I think people will go back to it, including myself, more than once. So that's why I'm going through this. For me, there is a level of exhaustion, and I'm fortunate that I have a job, and Jaime, you're fortunate because you have a job. But there are a lot of people who are exhausted. And the good news, if there is any from all this, is that people who didn't like technology and did not use it have now been forced to get there. So we should be able to do more public engagement online. I do, however, believe that things of this magnitude, not laws about fees and structures, not about, whether we should do this road or that road, which is a big part of what trustees do, to be honest with you, but things that involve public space need to be done in a format where the public can be more engaged and not at a time when they're at full-on exhaustion. For my part, if the ask tonight, first of all, the point was education tonight, so we got what we needed. You've already accomplished what we had asked for. So as far as I'm concerned, already a successful meeting. Again, the second part is an ask that we vote to move forward, not on this sort of the steps that you laid out, and to move forward with legislation that we would vote on next week. From my perspective, I don't feel that this is the right time to do that, because I think not only we've gotten a few emails, but we get a few emails about lots of stuff, almost everything we do. But even before those emails, there were members on this board that really conveyed a concern for how much the public can really understand what's going on. Not those of us sitting around this conversation who are engaged, but people who are living their life and whether they really understand the magnitude of this project. And because I don't believe that we have hit the height of the pandemic, and I'm not waiting for solution, because I'm pretty sure if we can't figure out the common cold, we're not going to figure this out. What we're going to do is figure out how to live through it. That I am not, and it'll be a vote on this board, and no one who's spoken, and I do have to ask the other three folks here, I don't know, Omar, if you're saying that you would like to see this legislation come up tomorrow. We all agree, 3 of the 5 of us had voted that we are supporters of this project. For me personally, that has not changed. I'm a supporter of this project. I voted for it. I'm still voting for it. I don't think the timing right now is right. And the reason we delayed it by a month is to see where we are now. In my opinion, we are still not there. And I want to table this for now. And the clock will start when the legislation comes. So I don't think Mr. Balter is out a whole lot, because I think Mr. Balter, I think he's on the call, by the way, and he can email us, his own opinions, is that this is about timing and about process. And what I've learned as a trustee is timing and process are actually really important. They're as important as the quality of a project. I don't want anybody to sit there and think that we rushed something through or did something at a time when people are thoroughly exhausted. So my ask of the other trustees is to delay this or table it for another month till we see where we are on many different levels in this community. I sound like I'm shaking. I'm hearing myself talk because it's freezing in my house. Sorry about that if I sound a little bit weird on the phone. That would be where I would like to go with this. And I need to ask my colleagues how, thumbs up, thumbs down, I can't see all of you, I'm sorry, of where you want to go. I feel like Omar said he wants to bring this up in legislation, but I don't think I heard Bob or Manny give that, and I don't want to speak for Omar, so I just need to hear from my colleagues what you want to do, because the ask is to bring this to legislation and vote on it next week.
I'll jump in there. A month ago, yeah, it was bad. And a month later, we're in better shape. We're not out of the weeds. I tend to agree with you, Rika, to table it for another month. And hopefully we progress in a better situation, a month from now. That's my feelings on it. I happen to agree with what you said. We're in better shape a month later, but we're not out of the weeds. I just don't think it's the right time right now. And that's my opinion.
Manny?
Yes. So I'm going to kind of take what Omar mentioned before. So he wants to move forward for next week. So my ask will be for us to, obviously, I'm a supporter of this project. Again, I voted for this last year. I'm still there today. So I guess looking at my calendar, we can either, a month from now will be more like June 17. That will be a month from now. Is that where we are heading? And we can ask Stuart and Karen, and obviously to have that part of the legislation, or we're looking at more towards June 3rd. That will be the first meeting of that month on the legislative portion.
I think the 17th would be about a month, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So we
Is that
basically,
legislative?
from understanding you, you're asking for them to have the legislation. We don't need another tutorial, but
No.
we've learned a lot tonight. We just want to, so on the 17th, to have legislation put in front of us at that meeting.
Correct.
Okay, I'm good with that.
I mean, and I think at that point we'll have a better understanding of what a month from now we'll see what this pandemic and has done and where we head. And I think I will have a little bit more. I'll do more research, and obviously we'll keep watching what's going on around us in regards to this situation that the world is going through. And I think we'll be able to make a better decision at that point. A fair decision for the developer and for the community.
Well, I think it starts the clock going. And for me, because we did this tonight, which I think was helpful in the sense that now members of the public who are interested have the ability to calmly sort of look at, what did you call it, I guess? Bob, did you say tutorial? I guess it's somewhat like that. We'll be able to. That's a good term.
It's a presentation, and they can go back and look at the video. But I can also give the presentation and allow people to view it on their own.
I think it's good. I think
Okay.
it's good because it gives them a month to chew on a little bit and go back to the presentation or the tutorial and be a little more informed of what the process is, because a lot of the thought process out there is, oh, they're just going to go build this building. And, we can't express that enough, that that's not what this is about. We want to build a building, but we want to go through the process, which includes the public. The public needs to understand that. This is why I feel 180 days, whatever that is, where are we going to be? Nobody knows. But I think tabling it for another month, having the legislation prepared, we're all got our ears to the rail of what's going on out around us. We'll be a little more informed by then to be able to, vote on that night.
And I think the public will have a chance to look at this rather than voting now and just giving them a week. So I think I don't see a downside to it, frankly, is my point of view. So we're getting 3 votes, and Omar, you would rather do this next week. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, well, here's how I feel about it. I would like to get some clarification from Eureka. So I would be fine, just to put it out there, I'd be fine waiting a month to put this on a legislative agenda. But my question would be, what would need to be true then that is not true now that would make you vote yes? And the reason that I ask that is because I do take to heart what you said about the community being exhausted. That's also kind of an ephemeral, it's a feeling, right? So I don't know, like, I don't have a way of measuring how exhausted the community is. I just get a sense from like talking to people I know and reading message boards and whatever. But I don't have a clear sense of that. So it could be that in a month, I don't imagine that a pandemic that has gone on for 2 months, people will feel rejuvenated by month 3. My sense is they'll probably be more exhausted. And so if our barometer for moving forward is, are people exhausted or not, they will continue to be exhausted. And so I would just like to know what would need to be true in order for you to say, despite the pandemic, it does make sense to move forward with the legislation because whatever conditions are met.
Okay, great question. So for me, things are moving very quickly. And so I think literally there is sort of a time frame where the governor makes announcements, and they tend to be in 2-week intervals. So between now and a month from now, we're going to see things opening. We're also going to have people who, while a month doesn't sound like a lot, I actually think it is, given how fast it's moving. People will be, in fact, discussing reopening. People will be more focused. People will make more adjustments to what's going on in the summer. People will have the ability, including us, as just members of the community, not as trustees, will also have a little bit more of a footing, in my opinion, to see where the state is. To Manny's earliest question about funding from the state, which is this is very dependent on, and where the state is going and the county and all that. Because right now we've got a lot of people who said a few months ago, yeah, there's money out there. That was one of the reasons that we moved forward with this, is that we were told there is money out there. All we were told is there's money. There's really very little in writing. And I think in a month, there is a very clear direction coming from government agencies about what needs to take place, and a little more of a gain of the footing, if you will, about budgets. And, I look at it as, for me, and I'm not speaking for the other gentleman on this call, so you asked me, so I'm answering the question. I think a month makes a big difference. And I also see no downside to it, is the other issue. If there was a downside to this, I think 3 times about it. But because I don't see a downside, and I do think a month is a big difference in what government decisions are made and what is being opened and what we can do and what budgets will look like and whether the state really will have money. Because right now all I'm hearing is they don't. And all I heard from George Latimer's, there's a deficit and there's no money. And a lot of this is coming from public money. As that is a big difference for me. So I do think a month, one hand, I see no downside. On the other hand, I see people catching their footing, because where we are today from a month ago is also very different. So I think a month is just not that big of a deal to wait, to also see if the state and the county do more than just say, yeah, we got you. Because, yeah, we got you at a time during a recession, the last recession we had, all of the financial promises made by the state of New York, the city of New York, and the county sort of didn't happen. So I'd like to get a little closer to going from promises to, yeah, the money's still there. If you recall, Omar, that was one of the things we as trustees were told. There's lots of money out there for this. The question you should be asking, really, me, if I were you right now, is why would you think a month is enough? It's because I really want this project to happen that I'm believing a month will be enough. Somebody else may say you really should wait longer. But again, this is all a balancing act, and we do have a little bit of, but we just heard George Latimer the other day, and all he said is how there's no money, and how things, unless they're obligated by law, there won't be money for it. This is not a secret that I'm sharing with the public. It's in all the media, it's in all the write-ups, it's common sense. And for any of us that have been through a recession, this is exactly what happened at every recession. And that part is part of the exhaustion I'm talking about, in addition to the literal physical exhaustion that people are going through. That's my rationale. I don't know if it makes sense to you, but, and it is a feeling. There's no data here.
Manny, and I know that Jaime may have, and Jaime, please do respond to Rika, but I'm also curious to hear after you finish from Bob and Manny, if their answer to the questions, what would need to be true a month from now in order for you to vote yes on this legislation? Please, Jaime.
All right, so I you know, I don't want to get too much into the details of what would be true. That's a political decision that the Board of Trustees really needs to make. But I do want to talk a little bit about what happened during the 2007 crisis and the stimulus money that came in for projects. I'm not sure if Ossining had any projects that were funded under the stimulus that came in around the time that Obama came in. But there were a lot of projects that were funded. All of those projects, almost universally, were projects that had detailed information about how that money could be spent and could be put into use right away. And the reason that they did that was because it was critical to fund projects that could be, you know, essentially spent down right away. People needed money, they needed jobs, and they couldn't give money to a project that was 5 years down the road in the pipeline.
Shovel ready.
And exactly, shovel ready. So you do remember this, great. And so I was trying to explain it really cogently, but yes,
We all
shovel
read.
ready projects.
This is like history here.
And so the importance of not waiting too long in any project is that you do want to create shovel-ready projects. You have a few things that are going to be public amenities likely to come from this project. One is a public garage that would be a component of the precast garage that's going to be built on the site to support that site, commercial, and any other uses. But there's also the Sing Sing Kill walkway, which requires public funding and financing to pay for that. Those are projects that need to be shovel ready if any funding does come down the road for this to be, you know, useful for coronavirus funding that may be coming, could, you know, reasonably be expected. So you don't want to wait too long because the longer you wait, the longer you risk not having any projects to be funded under a future stimulus. That really probably will happen at some point soon.
Right, but you're not saying. I mean, I'm
not saying you can make a decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you move from being a planner to discussing that, I think that becomes. I would just say that not actually exactly the way I would have said it, and I've lived through it. So, and I think the people who live in this community, who came from the city and all that, also have other recollections of how the government dealt with things. But be that as it may. The answer to Omar's question, because we're like at 9:02 right now. So Manny and Bob, do you want to sort of bring this home? If you want to, you don't have to answer the question.
No. Of course. You know, and again, so kind of going back a little bit of what was said early today, you know, we hold off making a decision of just bringing this conversation a month ago for two things, sure. One, we didn't know what was going on around us, you know, the situation and the economics and the finances and the health around our community and our world. Two, we had asked Jaime actually to prepare something like this in regards to the process, what an RFQ is and what does that mean. So we did that. It was done today. And we still see, it was mentioned obviously that, you know, the numbers are not raising like it was before, you know, even like 3 weeks ago. But, you know, to me, it's not really, I want to have some sort of we want to be some sort of in a stable situation in regards to what is the, you know, how do we move forward? And I think a month from now, that will be a little bit more clear on what that means for our state, our country, and around ourselves and what's going on. Obviously, we don't control what other municipalities and what other governments do. You know, we kind of control what we do here. And I think a month from now is going to be a different conversation. And I think, you know, and I don't want to speak for anybody or my colleagues in here, but it could be a yes or it could be a no. But it was going to be a reasoning, you know, behind that. And you know, again, I'm supportive of this project, and I think a month from now, it's not going to hurt anything what was going on.
So, Manny,
we about this since last year, so.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, Manny. So my question, because I think we're in agreement that we'll wait the month. My question is, I just want to fast forward. Let's pretend it's a month from now. If because you said you were in agreement with Deputy Mayor Levin that the community is exhausted and the timing isn't right, which is a point that I understand. And I was making the point that is there a way to either quantify that, or how would you, can you be more specific in what you're looking for in terms of determining whether the community is in a place that it will be able to participate in a way that you would feel comfortable with?
It's not even about the relationship and how do we going to engage the community itself. You know, as you mentioned before, we are moving forward. I believe we're moving forward with the comp plan. And my recollection is you had doubts. You have a 5% doubts in moving forward with this. You know, how do we do that? You know, you were positive at 95%, but the other 5% was like, yeah, maybe not.
That's right.
So you know, so again, so it's the same way. Sure, I don't have an answer for that. You know, I've been through a process where, you know, controversial projects have gone in front of us, and people have come out. You know, community members have, you know, have made their voices heard in a lot of the ones. I could mention a couple of them, but I'm you know, it's already 9:05, so I don't want to keep moving too much of our time in this. But you know, I think it is more, to me, is more like what the finances are within our state and this whole project.
I'm sorry.
That's all.
Can I just say one thing, because I've had a fair amount of experience with state projects. So in this case, you're going to go through a period when the clock starts ticking, is obviously up to the board. The same way that if you cannot come to an agreement about the LADA, if the money's not there, then that also will impact the project going forward. So the advantage here is not waiting till the money is available for this type of project, because if you wait for that, if there's 100 other projects that have started and are shovel ready, you will lose that opportunity. So there's really no harm, no foul in starting the process independent of understanding, because none of us know what that's going to look like. And even in the best of situations, when the grant programs are flush with funding, they don't guarantee anything. So that is something that will happen or not almost regardless, and timing that is very challenging. The other thing is, and I'm going to just ask Corporation Counsel, the time that we set for the engagement period of a preferred developer is variable. And I believe that regardless of when you set the clock, if you were finding that public engagement was not moving as quickly, or people, that you could extend that